The following recording is an excerpt from article entitled Self-Deception, published by Metaphysics Research Lab, Stanford University. Author Ian DeWeese Boyd. To read the article in its entirety, we have included a link down in the description below this video. Article Self-Deception. Virtually every aspect of self-deception, including its definition and paradigmatic cases, is a matter of controversy among philosophers. Minimally, self-deception involves a person who, A, as a consequence of some motivation or emotion, seems to acquire and maintain some false belief, despite evidence to the contrary, and B, who may display behavior suggesting some awareness of the truth. Beyond this, philosophers divide over whether self-deception is intentional, whether it involves belief or some other sub- or non-doxastic attitude, whether self-deceivers are morally responsible for their self-deception, whether self-deception is morally problematic, and if it is, in what ways and under what circumstances, whether self-deception is beneficial or harmful, whether and in what sense collectives can be self-deceived, and how, if they can be self-deceived, this might affect individuals within such collectives, and whether our penchant for self-deception might be socially, psychologically, or biologically adaptive, or merely an accidental byproduct of our evolutionary history. The discussion of self-deception and its associated puzzles sheds light on the way motivation affects belief acquisition and retention and other belief-like cognitive attitudes. It also prompts us to scrutinize the notions of belief, intention, and the limits of such folk psychological concepts to adequately explain phenomena of this sort. Self-deception also requires careful consideration of the cognitive architecture that might accommodate this apparent irrationality regarding our beliefs. Self-deception isn't merely a philosophically interesting puzzle, but a problem of existential concern. It raises the distinct possibility that we live with distorted views that may make us strangers to ourselves and blind to the nature of our morally significant engagements. 1. Paradoxes, puzzles, and problems of self-deception. What is self-deception? Sounds like a straightforward question, but the more philosophers have sought to answer it, the more puzzling it has become. Traditionally, self-deception has been modeled on interpersonal deception, where A intentionally gets B to believe some proposition P, all the while knowing or believing truly that non-P. Such deception is intentional and requires the deceiver to know or believe that non-P, and the deceived to believe that proposition. One reason for thinking self-deception is analogous to interpersonal deception of this sort is that it helps us to distinguish self-deception from mere error, since the acquisition and maintenance of the false belief are intentional, not accidental. It also helps to explain why we think self-deceivers are responsible for and open to the evaluation of their self-deception. If self-deception is properly modeled on interpersonal deception, self-deceivers intentionally get themselves to believe that P, all the while knowing or believing truly that not P. On this traditional model, then, self-deceivers apparently must, 1, hold contradictory beliefs, the dual belief requirement, and 2, intentionally get themselves to hold a belief they know or believe truly to be false. The traditional model of self-deception, however, has been thought to raise two paradoxes. One concerns the self-deceiver's state of mind, the so-called static paradox. How can a person simultaneously hold contradictory beliefs? The other concerns the process or dynamics of self-deception, the so-called dynamic or strategic paradox. How can a person intend to deceive herself without rendering her intentions ineffective? Meehl, 1987, 2001. The dual belief requirement raises the static paradox since it seems to pose an impossible state of mind, namely, consciously and simultaneously believing that P and non-P as deceiver. The dual belief requirement raises the static paradox since it seems to pose an impossible state of mind, namely, consciously and simultaneously believing that P and not P. As deceiver, she believes that not P, and as deceived, she believes that P. Accordingly, the self-deceiver consciously believes that P and not P. But if believing both a proposition and its negation in full awareness is an impossible state of mind, self-deception, as it has traditionally been understood, seems impossible as well. Static paradoxes also arise regarding motivation, intention, emotion, and the like, insofar as self-deceivers seem to harbor psychological states of these kinds that seem deeply incompatible. Funkhauser, 2019. The requirement that the self-deceiver intentionally gets herself to hold a belief she knows to be false raises the dynamic or strategic paradox since it seems to involve the self-deceiver in an impossible project, namely, both deploying and being duped by some deceitful strategy. As deceiver, she must be aware that she's deploying a deceitful strategy. But as deceived, she must be unaware of this strategy for it to be effective. And yet, it's difficult to see how the self-deceiver could fail to be aware of her intention to deceive. A strategy known to be deceitful seems bound to fail. How could I be taken in by your efforts to get me to believe something false if I know what you're up to? But if it's impossible to be taken in by a strategy one knows is deceitful, then again, self-deception, as it has traditionally been understood, seems to be impossible as well. These paradoxes have led a minority of philosophers to be skeptical that self-deception is conceptually possible or even coherent. Pollock, 1977, Haidt, 1980, Kipp, 1980, Borges, 2003, contends that accounts of self-deception inevitably give up central elements of our folk psychological notions of self or deception. To avoid paradox, leaving us to wonder whether this framework itself is what gets in the way of explaining the phenomenon. Such skepticism toward the concept may seem warranted, given the obvious paradoxes involved. Most philosophers, however, have sought some resolution to these paradoxes. Instead of giving up on the notion itself, not only because empirical evidence suggests that self-deception is not only possible but pervasive, Sandra and Thegard, 2003, but also because the concept does seem to pick out a distinct kind of motivated irrationality. Philosophical accounts of self-deception roughly fall into two main groups: those that maintain that the paradigmatic cases of self-deception are intentional and those that deny this. call these approaches the intentionalist and revisionist, respectively. Intentionalists find the model of intentional interpersonal deception apt, since it helps to explain the selectivity of self-deception and the apparent responsibility of self-deceivers, as well as provide a clear way of distinguishing self-deception from other sorts of motivated belief, such as wishful thinking. To avoid paradox, these approaches introduce a variety of divisions that shield the deceiving from the deceived mind. Revisionists are skeptical of these divisions and the psychological exotica, Mel 2001, apparently needed to avoid the static and dynamic paradoxes. Instead, they argue that revision of the intention requirement, the belief requirement, or both offers a simpler account of self-deception that avoids the paradoxes raised by modeling it on intentional interpersonal deception. 2. Intentionalist approach. The chief problem facing intentional models of self-deception is the dynamic paradox, namely, that it seems impossible to form an intention to get oneself to believe what one currently disbelieves or believes is false. For one to carry out an intention to deceive oneself, one must know what one is doing. To succeed, one must be ignorant of this same fact. It seems impossible to form an intention to get oneself to believe what one currently disbelieves or believes is false. For one to carry out an intention to deceive oneself, one must know what one is doing to succeed. To succeed, one must be ignorant of this same fact. Intentionalists agree that self-deception is intentional, or at least robustly purposive, but divide over whether it requires holding contradictory beliefs, and thus over the specific content of the alleged intention involved. Insofar as even the bare intention to acquire the belief that P, for reasons having nothing to do with one's evidence for P, seems unlikely to succeed if directly known. Most intentionalists introduce some sort of temporal or psychological partition to insulate self-deceivers from their deceptive stratagems. When self-deceivers are not consciously aware of what they truly believe or intend, it's easier to see how they can play a role of the deceiver and the deceived by dividing the mind into parts, temporally or psychologically. These approaches seek to show that self-deception does not involve paradox. 2.1 Temporal partitioning. Some intentionalists argue that self-deception is a complex, temporally extended process during which a self-deceiver can consciously set out to deceive herself that P, knowing or believing that non-P, and along the way lose her belief that non-P, either forgetting her original deceptive intention entirely or regarding it as having, albeit accidentally, brought about the true belief she would have arrived at anyway. Sorensen, 1985, Bermudez, 2000. So, for instance, an official involved in some illegal behavior might destroy any record of this behavior and create evidence that would cover it up, diary entries, emails, and the like, knowing that she will likely forget having done these things over the next few months. When her activities are investigated a year later, she has forgotten her tampering efforts and based upon her falsified evidence, comes to believe falsely that she was not involved in the illegal activity of which she is accused. Here, the self-deceiver need never simultaneously hold contradictory beliefs, even though she intends to bring it about that she believes that P, which she regards as false at the outset of the process of deceiving herself, and true at its completion. The self-deceiver need not even forget her original intention to deceive. Take an atheist who sets out to get herself to believe in God because it seems the best bet if God turns out to exist. She might well remember such an intention at the end of the process and deem that by God's grace, even this misguided path led her to the truth. What enables the intention to succeed in such cases is the operation of what Johnston, 1988, terms autonomous means. The normal degradation of memory, the tendency to believe what one practices, etc. Not the continued awareness of the intention, hinting that the process may be sub-intentional. While such temporal partitioning accounts appear to avoid the static and the dynamic paradoxes, many, if not most, cases of self-deception aren't of this temporally extended type. Regularly, self-deception seems to occur instantaneously. Jordan, 2022. As when a philosopher self-deceives that her article is high quality even while reading the substantive accurate criticisms in the rejection letter from the prestigious peer-reviewed journal she submitted it to. Example due to Mel 2001. Additionally, many of these temporally extended cases lack the distinctive opacity, indirection, and tension associated with garden variety cases of self-deception. Levi 2004. 2.2 Psychological partitioning. Another strategy employed by intentionalists is the division of the self into psychological parts that play the role of the deceiver and the deceived, respectfully. These strategies range from positing strong division in the self, where the deceiving part is a relatively autonomous sub-agency capable of belief, desire, and intention. Royde, 1988. To more moderate division, where the deceiving part still constitutes a separate center of agency. Pierce, 1984, 1986, 1991. To the relatively modest division of Davidson, 1982-1986, where there need only be a boundary between conflicting attitudes and intentions. Such divisions are prompted in large part by the acceptance of the dual belief requirement. It isn't simply that self-deceivers hold contradictory beliefs, which, though strange, isn't impossible since one can believe that P and believe that non-P without believing that P and non-P. The problem such theorists face stems from the appearance that the belief that non-P motivates and thus forms a part of the intention to bring it about that one acquires and maintains the false belief that P. Davidson, 1986. So, for example, the Nazi official's recognition that his actions implicate him in a serious evil motivates him to implement a strategy to deceive himself into believing he is not so involved. He can't intend to bring it about that he holds such a false belief if he doesn't recognize it is false. And he wouldn't want to bring such a belief about if he didn't recognize the evidence to the contrary. So long as this is the case, the deceiving self, whether it constitutes a separate center of agency or something less robust, must be hidden from the conscious self being deceived if the self-deceptive intention is to succeed. While these psychological partitioning approaches seem to resolve the static and dynamic puzzles, they do so by introducing a picture of the mind that raises puzzles of its own. On this point, there appears to be consensus, even among intentionalists, that self-deception can and should be accounted for without invoking speculative or stipulative divisions, not already used to explain non-self-deceptive behavior, what Talbot 1995 calls innocent divisions. That said, recent, if controversial research, Barr and Marcella 2008, Hassan, Barr and Zimmerman 2009, Huang and Barr 2014, seems to support the possibility of the sort of robust unconscious but flexible goal pursuit that could explain the way self-deceivers are able to pursue their deceptive goal while retaining the beliefs necessary for navigating the shifting evidential terrain. See Funkhauser and Barrett 2016, 2017, and Duty 2016 for skepticism about the applicability of this research to self-deception. If this kind of research shows that no psychological exotica are necessary to explain self-deception, there is less pressure to deflate the phenomenon in ways that minimize the active, strategic role self-deceivers play in the process. 3. Revisionist approach. A number of philosophers have moved away from modeling self-deception directly on intentional interpersonal deception, opting instead to revise either the intention or the belief requirement traditional intentionalist models assume. Those revising the intention requirement typically treat self-deception as a species of motivationally biased beliefs, thus avoiding the problems involved with intentionally deceiving oneself. Call these non-intentionalists and deflationary approaches. Those revising the belief requirement do so in a variety of ways. Some posit other non-doxastic or quasi-doxastic attitudes towards the proposition involved. Misrepresentation, Jordan 2020, 2022. Hope, suspicion, doubt, anxiety, Archer 2013, Desires, Egan 2009, Pretense, Gendler 2007, Imagination, Lazar 1999. Others alter the content of the proposition believed. Holton 2001, Funkhauser 2005, Fernandez 2013. While others suggest the doxastic attitudes involved are interdeterminate, somehow in between believing, or subject to shifting degrees of credulity throughout the process of self-deception. The process of self-deception. Chan and Rowbottom 2019 call these revision of belief approaches. Deflationary approaches focus primarily on the process of self-deception, while the revision of belief approaches focus on the product. A revision of either of these aspects, of course, has ramifications for the other. For example, if self-deception doesn't involve belief, but some other doxastic attitude, product, then one may well be able to intentionally enter that state without paradox, process. This section considers non-intentional and deflationary approaches and the worries such approaches raise. It also considers revision of belief approaches. This marks the end of the audio excerpt of article entitled Self-Deception by Ian Deweese Boyd, which can be found on plato.stanford.edu, link down in the description. Now, this audio excerpt serves as a great companion with the Book of Hebrews Study Guide Lesson 2 Part 3 video, where we discuss self-deception and some of the psychological going-ons that the original audience might have been experiencing, why they were going back to temple sacrifice, and it seems like the author of Hebrews almost has to address their belief system as well as their character and their desires both at the same time. This article can serve to give some insight into it from a philosophical point of view. And again, link to the full article can be found below this video in the description.